All right, let's have this conversation now. And independent candidates, for example, talking about how tough it has been on the campaign trail. They speak about issues of funding, but also at the same time, you listen to some smaller parties as well. They talk about the issues of funding that continue to be a headache for them. But you then look at the big political parties as well. They pulled out all the stops in order to try and woo the voters. But at the same time, there's another issue. The manifestos. How many people actually went through the 200-odd page manifestos in some cases, and others, of course, when you look at some of the manifestos online, just how many people did have time to peruse through some of the manifestos, and looking at some of the political parties that held their own final rallies at the weekend. So let's look at the campaign trail and some of the issues now. We do have in studio with us Dr. Sithembile Mbete, a political analyst, who's joining us in studio. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Mbete.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Let's start with, you know, there's a lot to talk about when you look at the campaign trail, right? But I'd like us to start with the manifestos that the political parties were presenting to the voters and all of that. When you look at the manifestos, what impact do you think they had, especially given the fact that some of them were quite sizable?
Look, manifestos don't really have a big impact anywhere. It's not just a South African phenomenon. In elections all over the world, I mean, there's about 64 elections happening around the world. Half of the world's population is voting. India, the biggest democracy in the world, has voting happening over 6 weeks. Voters don't engage so much with the detail of manifestos. They'll pick up some of the highlights and what it is that the political parties speak about in a rally, or when they go and they meet people door to door, or what gets picked up by the media. But very few voters actually read through a full 200-page or even 80 or 30-page manifesto. People just don't have the time to do it, right? And so there's always a great deal of debate amongst political scientists about is there any point to manifestos? Are they actually useful? And I think that there is a particular audience that manifestos are designed for. People like politics professors, like myself, or or academics like myself, for in a situation where you're wanting to be the government, so not just in the opposition. Manifestos are what investors will look at to try and see, where a particular party wants to take the country, or that other countries, that diplomats will look at to say, well, what can we expect from this party if it becomes the government of a particular country? So there's a particular audience that is, of course, going to be very interested in the manifestos and what they have to say. But for the ordinary voter, voters vote on a number of issues and on the basis of a number of things that aren't all captured in the manifesto. And I think what's important about that is that we tend to speak about voters who aren't reading the manifestos as somehow stupid or lazy or careless, and that's not the case. People are busy, people have lots of stuff to do, and manifestos are for a very specialized audience, and many people are looking at other things to determine whether or not they should vote for a particular party.
And I suppose then, one could then maybe ask the question, because sometimes even as members of the media, we do go through the manifestos, but you find that in some of the cases, we are potentially maybe also not breaking them down for the people out there. But there's so many of them. I mean, looking at right now, so many of the political parties, over 70, you're also looking at candidates as well who are independent, who are entering the space for the first time. So how do they begin to simplify the message, particularly for those who say, I don't have time, and another one who says, okay, I can still have the 200-page odd?
Look, and I think that this is where the media is so important in political campaigning and in an election campaign period, right? Is that it is the media that we hope, and I know this isn't always the case, have the resources, have some of the time, have some of the researchers and those people who can go through, have people like us, as the analysts that you work with, who will have had time to go through all of the manifestos and then can digest those and pull out what's most important for your viewers who are sitting at home watching the news, to be able to say, well, this is really interesting, that's come up and something that you should know. We've seen also there's been quite a lot of the print media, whether they are producing, actual newspapers or online, who have done, summaries of various manifestos. And I think those are really useful for the ordinary person to know exactly what it is that the parties are promising you and how they intend to go about fulfilling those promises.
You've watched the space over time, and I wonder, in your view then, because sometimes we hear of political parties who are saying that if we are still to hold our final rallies a weekend before we go to an election, we're doing this targeting some of the undecided voters who are going to go there and still try to make sense of who to vote for. But others are saying that's too late because voters actually make up their minds early. What are you finding there?
Look, we saw the Afrobarometer survey that came out earlier today that showed that there were about, I think it was 33% undecided voters of those that they had polled. So out of their polling, about 30% of people, a full third of people said that they didn't know who they were going to vote for. And that's a huge number of undecided voters. If you look, we've got about 27 million registered voters, so that would be 8 to 9 million people who would say that I don't know who to vote for. I can vote, but I don't know who I want to vote for. And so that's a big number, and I think it's it's a higher number than we've seen in previous elections of undecided voters. And I think that points to a real interesting feature of the campaigns this year, which is that they really seemed to be targeted at the traditional voting base of the political parties, not so much targeted at attracting new voters, either voters that want to switch from another party or newly registered voters. We didn't see a lot of trying to attract new voters, but rather speaking to political parties' base to try to get them to stick with their party and to make sure that they turn out on vote on Wednesday. And I think that's a missed opportunity, actually, amongst particularly the established parties, of not really speaking to new entrants as far as voters are concerned. The people that were trying to speak, I think, to new voters were the new parties that have come up, the small parties that you were talking about, and also some of the independents. But of course, they have difficulties of resources. And you were mentioning earlier that you've had independent candidates and small parties really talk about how much they've struggled to raise funds to be able to campaign. And I think that's an important conversation about one of the features of our system in South Africa. We do have allocations for public funding of political parties in South Africa, whether that is public funding that comes through the IEC or public funding that comes through the legislatures, the provincial legislatures and the national parliament. But that funding is generally, it's only for represented parties. So if you've already shown that you've won some votes in an election at national or provincial level, then you have got access to public funding from the IEC or from the legislatures. And so what that means is that when you get your foot through the door, if you're a small party and then you get elected, it's much easier for you to be re-elected because you get access to funding that you otherwise wouldn't have. If you're a small party that's new, that's never been represented in a provincial legislature or in the National Assembly, it is so much harder for you to raise funds because the only funds you can rely on, or the only funds that you can actually raise, are private sources of funding.
And how do we begin to have a conversation around that? Because you hear sometimes other analysts are saying that's a good safeguarding mechanism because it means then that you will not have everyone come to the table to access the funding and then disappear. But at the same time, there are others who are saying, but what about the actual individuals who really, really want to be in this race for the long haul? Are you then saying that these barriers to entry are enough in order to, support them, but also in other cases you're keeping them out, essentially?
Well, I think that the whole idea is it's all based on the idea that if people want to do it badly enough that they'll figure out a way. And I think that when you can see that we've had, it's 74 parties that are registered to contest at national and at provincial level, 52 parties that are going to be contesting nationally, and then other smaller parties that are going to be contesting particular provinces. There are clearly parties, and there are the 11 independent candidates, 6 at national and 5 in the provinces that have tried to raise some funds to be able to do so. And the point around it being, that the barriers to entry are to have people not abuse public funding and public finances, that you need to show already that you've got a constituency, and that is an important guardrail, it's an important measure to ensure that the public's finances aren't being abused by chances, But I do think that we must continue having the conversation around political party funding. We saw today that the court upheld My Vote Counts' case, its appeal against the Electoral Matters Amendment Act, which was there to amend parts of the Political Party Funding Act. And the court has upheld for a period of time the position that the current thresholds that had existed in the original act, that funding below 100,000 Rand doesn't need to be reported, and funding can only be from a single source to a maximum of 15 million Rand, that those thresholds have been reinstated by the courts until new thresholds are developed.
And it's quite important because you listen to a number of people who are saying if you let go of these thresholds, you're basically taking us on a dangerous path when it comes to issues of transparency, which is then a regression of where we used to find ourselves in the past.
Exactly, yes. And the reason why we had the Political Party Act, Party Funding Act introduced in the first place was to regulate these private sources of funding so that we know, what is going on. And then parties and candidates are forced to become accountable to the people to really explain where their sources of funding come from. We've already seen that there's a huge public controversy at the moment, or on social media in particular, around one of the newer parties, Rise Mzansi, around their sources of funding. And I think it's a good thing that parties and that politicians have to account to us and tell us where are they getting their funding, who are they beholden to, if they are beholden to anyone. And I think that it's important also remembering it in the context, as I've said, of the challenges of raising money for democracy. Democracy is expensive.
Very.
They didn't tell us just how much it was going to cost.
Yes, when you listen to independents.
It is expensive. It's expensive to campaign. It is expensive to... Also, we underestimate just how big a country South Africa is. South Africa is wide, it's long. You're traveling very long distances, sometimes within the same city, within the same province. And so it costs a lot of money. And I think that it is important that we keep regulating those sources of funding. But then also thinking about what are the more creative ways that we can think about to make it more accessible, to make political participation, political contestation more accessible for people, for outsiders, for people that aren't already in the system. The Political Party Funding Act did establish a multi-party democracy fund that is supposed to be a fund where there's no thresholds there, so the private sector, private individuals can put money into that fund, and then those funds be distributed by the IEC on an equal basis to all political parties. But what we've seen is that there hasn't been a lot of take-up of that fund from private sources, whether that is companies or high net worth individuals, haven't really supported that multi-party democracy fund. And I think that it's one of the best ways to have to raise the resources that are required, but to have them distributed in such a way that it doesn't threaten independence or integrity or the accountability of the political parties that are receiving the funds. But I think we really need to be creative about how we do this in the future.
And as you say, I mean, things are getting quite expensive, and it does look like some of the barriers become an even barrier to democracy participation for some of these parties as well. But I want to stay with something you said earlier, and this is around, some of the political parties making a choice to speak to their traditional voters as opposed to trying something new, which would be people that have never voted for them before. Now, is this, do you think, in a sense, because they kind of understand the political dynamics and where South Africa is right now, so rather not dice, and put yourself at risk of also losing some of your traditional voters? Or is there something else that we may not be seeing there?
think that there is this is the most uncertain, this is the election with the most uncertain outcome, at least as far as the national election goes, since 1994. Since 1994, we've been pretty sure who's going to win nationally, whether they're going to win with a lot or with a little, but we've been pretty sure who the governing party is going to be nationally. In the last 15 years, we've had a pretty good sense that the Western Cape will always be, will definitely be governed by the DA with some kind of majority. And then the other provinces are most likely to be governed by the ANC. That has been a certainty where you're then quibbling over percentages, but this seems to be it's a first election since 1994 where we can't say that for sure.
Yeah.
We think, so some of us think that the ANC will be able to be the government from Monday next week after the election result is announced on Sunday, but we don't know for sure. Other people say there's no way that's going to happen. The ANC is going to get 39%, 38%, and somebody else is going to be the government. We think that the DA will be able, I think that the DA will be able to form a government in the Western Cape on Monday next week. Other people say no, they will lose so much that other people will be able to have a chance. And so in that context of deep uncertainty, and where my frustration with some of the polls is that the polls aren't saying to the new voters, who do you want to vote for? Or to the, or to people who did vote before and then didn't vote in the last election but are going to vote now. Who exactly, we don't have a lot of specifics around the polls. So in that context, the safest bet for parties is to make sure that you get your support base out. And then hope that enough of your messaging has reached the others to be able to then, to be able to get a few extra votes on Wednesday. So I think that a lot of the playing it safe is really a function of a product of this uncertain environment that we're in, and also the uncertainty around the actual. I think we're pretty certain about the mood of the electorate, which is, despondent, distrustful, disgruntled, uncertain. We're certain about the mood, but we're not really certain about what will that mood translate into. Does that mean people are going to stay at home and not vote? Does that mean that people are going to turn out and do a protest vote? We don't know. And I think that is what has driven a lot of the established parties really playing it safe and making sure that they get their traditional supporters out, and then they'll see and hope that some extras will come along with them.
It feels like I've had you for all of 2 minutes. We can talk the whole night about some of these. We have the whole week to even talk about, some of the polling, as you say, because that's also been, one of those things that have been so uncertain. I mean, we see polls that are miles apart, and also speaking to where we are. And some of the questions possibly that now need to be, refurbished and rethought in order to be able to get the current state of our democracy. But thank you so much, Dr. Mbethe. Do appreciate your time. That was Dr. Sithembile Mbethe, the political analyst. And remember, we are still going to be here. We are going to be making sure that you get all the election coverage, the updates, the provinces, the reporters on the ground. Trust the SABC to bring you all these developments front and center.